The gun was already in her hand when Charles Ashford walked through the saloon door. Not pointed at anyone. Not reckless. Calculated. The barrel rested against her thigh, angled just enough to remind the room that she knew exactly what she was doing, and that every man who had called her foolish in the last 6 months had simply failed to understand the language she was speaking. "Rose Bancroft," said the man across the room, his name being Gerald Holt, the land agent whose forged deeds had stolen 3 ranches in the last year alone. "You are making a very dangerous mistake." "You've been telling me that since January," Rose said. Her voice was even, calm as still water over sharp rock. "And yet here we are, and you're sweating and I'm not." The room had gone silent. 14 men, maybe 15, all of them watching the woman in the dusty riding coat with the auburn hair pulled back from a face that had seen too much sun and too much grief to be called soft anymore. They had all heard the stories. Rose Bancroft, who rode out alone into the canyon territories to survey land claims. Rose Bancroft, who challenged a county assessor's figures in front of the circuit judge and won. Rose Bancroft, who had been told by her own attorney that she was reckless, impulsive, and that her stubbornness would get her killed before 30. She was 27 years old. She was not dead yet. Charles Ashford had come to Dust Creek, Texas in March of 1882 for reasons he told no one, and the reasons had nothing to do with Rose Bancroft. He was a surveyor, employed by the Texas General Land Office, and he had been sent to investigate a series of fraudulent land transfers that had been quietly destroying small ranching families across Hale County for the better part of 2 years. He was quiet, competent, and completely unremarkable at first glance. Medium height, broad in the shoulder, dark hair going slightly silver at the temples at 31, and a way of watching a room that suggested he was reading it rather than merely occupying it. He had arrived on a Tuesday. He had spent Wednesday reviewing county records in the back office of the courthouse. He had spent Thursday watching Rose Bancroft argue with the county clerk about 3 missing survey markers and a suspicious property transfer dated 6 weeks before the previous owner had supposedly signed the documents. He had stood in the doorway of that clerk's office and watched her work through the problem out loud, not to the clerk, but to herself, turning it over in her mind, speaking her logic in clear, connected sentences while the clerk stared at her like she was reciting a foreign language. He had watched the moment she found the contradiction she was looking for, a date discrepancy of 11 days that meant the deed transfer was signed before the surveying was officially completed, which was legally impossible. He had watched her go very still when she found it, not triumphant, not reckless, still. The way a person goes still when they realize they have just discovered something that is going to cost them enormously. He had said nothing. He had walked away. He had not been the same since. That was 3 weeks before the moment in the saloon, with the gun against her thigh, and Gerald Holt sweating through his collar. The way to understand Rose Bancroft, and almost no one in Dust Creek had ever truly tried, was to understand what she had survived in the 6 years before she arrived in Hale County. She had been born in Missouri in 1855, the daughter of a land surveyor named Thomas Bancroft, who had the misfortune of being meticulous, principled, and poor. Her mother, Clara, had died of typhoid fever when Rose was 11, and Thomas Bancroft had raised his daughter alone, which in practice meant he had raised her the way he knew how, which was to teach her everything he knew about measuring land, reading property records, understanding the legal framework of claim and title, and thinking in long chains of logical consequence. When Rose was 17, Thomas Bancroft was killed, not by outlaws, not by accident, by a business partner named Elias Dre, who had falsified survey records to steal a contract worth several hundred acres of fertile river bottomland. And when Thomas Bancroft had discovered the falsification and refused to be silent about it, Elias Dre had arranged for a riding accident that no one officially questioned because Elias Dre was a man of standing and Thomas Bancroft was not. Rose had known. She had been 17 and she had known, And she had also known with a clarity that was far beyond her years that no one would believe her, that no one would act on her belief, and that the only way to ever fight a man like Elias Dre was to become better at his game than he was, which meant she needed to grow up first. So she had. She had worked as a seamstress in Kansas City for 4 years, saving every dollar, reading every law book she could find at the public library, learning the specifics of land title law and survey methodology from memory. At 21, she had moved to Abilene, where she spent 2 years working as an assistant to a legitimate land surveyor named Marcus Webb, who was the first person in her adult life to treat her intelligence as an asset rather than a curiosity. When Marcus retired to New Mexico in 1879, he had given her his surveying equipment and a letter of recommendation that called her the most technically precise surveyor he had ever trained. She had been drifting toward Hale County for 3 years, following the same pattern of fraudulent land transfers that had killed her father, because she had come to understand that it was a pattern, a systematic method used by a network of land agents and corrupt local officials to strip small ranchers of legally acquired land, and the network had a shape, and she was tracing its shape backward toward its source. Gerald Holt was not the source. He was close. He was a node in the network, and Rose had spent 5 months in Dust Creek building the documentary evidence that would prove his connection to at least 8 fraudulent transfers, and she had made it look like she was a reckless woman who asked too many questions and got into arguments she could not win, because a reckless woman who seemed to be losing was not a threat. A woman who was quietly assembling a flawless legal case was. The man who understood this, or had begun to understand it, was Charles Ashford. He had come to Dust Creek to investigate the same network from the opposite direction. The Texas General Land Office had been tracking irregularities in Hale County for 18 months, and Charles had been chosen for the investigation because he was good at being invisible, and he was methodical, and he had a reputation for building cases that held together in court even when powerful people tried to dismantle them. He had not expected to find someone else already in the middle of it. He had not expected her. The first time they spoke directly was on a Thursday evening in April, outside the general store on Main Street. Charles had been reviewing a property map that he had tacked to a board propped against the store's outer wall, and Rose had walked past, glanced at the map, stopped, and without introduction or preamble said, "You have the survey markers for the Callahan property wrong. The eastern boundary runs 40 feet north of where you have it marked. Someone moved the physical stakes 2 years ago, but the original survey plat from 1876 shows the correct line. I have a copy." Charles had looked at her. He had been holding a pencil. He had lowered it slowly. "Who are you?" he said. "Rose Bancroft," she said. "I have been watching you for 10 days. You are either working against Holt or you are working for him. And given that you have been spending considerable time in the land records office rather than in his company, I am inclined to believe the former. I also believe you are from the land office, because your surveying equipment has a government inventory mark on the transit case that you covered with a leather strap, but not quite well enough." She had said all of this in a level, matter-of-fact tone, while a wagon rolled past on the street, and the evening light turned everything amber and dusk golden. She had not been performing intelligence. She had simply been stating what she knew. Charles had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had said, "Show me the 1876 plat." That was how it had begun, not romantically, not with any particular warmth, with the careful, cautious handshake of two people who have been working alone for too long and have suddenly recognized someone who might, possibly, be trustworthy. The next 2 weeks were the strangest and most illuminating weeks of Charles Ashford's life. He had worked alongside people before, investigators and surveyors and legal clerks, and he had always been the most precise person in the room. It was not arrogance. It was simply true. He paid closer attention than most, remembered more, connected dots that others missed. He had built his professional identity quietly around this fact. Then he began working with Rose Bancroft and discovered what it felt like to be the second most precise person in the room. She did not show off. That was what struck him first. She did not perform her intelligence for an audience the way some people did, using it as a kind of social weapon or a means of establishing dominance. She simply worked. She spread papers across a table and moved between them in a pattern that seemed random and turned out to be anything but, connecting documents that were separated by years and counties and nominal subjects until the shape of a thing emerged that had been invisible before. She annotated in the margins in a tiny, cramped handwriting that was perfectly legible once you adjusted your eyes to its scale. She drew diagrams when the spatial relationships mattered and wrote sequences when they did not. She kept 2 notebooks, one for facts and one for inferences, and she was rigorous about never letting an inference migrate to the facts book until she had corroboration. He watched her do this for 3 days before he said anything about it, and what he said was, "Your inference tracking system is better than the one the land office trains us to use." She looked up from her notebook. "I developed it after someone once told me that women were prone to emotional reasoning and should not be trusted to distinguish between what they knew and what they merely felt strongly about." She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if she had said it with bitterness. I decided to be unimpeachable. I keep the categories separate because if I ever present this work to a judge or a jury, I need to be able to demonstrate that every move from inference to established fact was justified by evidence, not by instinct. Charles set down his pencil. "Your father was Thomas Bancroft." She had been looking back at her notebook. Now she looked up again, and her expression changed in a way he would spend a long time trying to describe to himself. It was not shock. It was something more like recognition, the expression of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for so long that the sudden presence of another person who knew about it felt like being touched unexpectedly on a bruise. "How do you know that name?" she said. "Because Thomas Bancroft filed a complaint with the Missouri Survey Board in 1872 about falsified records on the Dray contract. The complaint was buried, but it was filed, and it became part of a larger file that the land office has been building on the pattern of fraudulent transfers for 15 years. His name is in that file. I read it before I came to Texas." He paused. "I am sorry about what happened to him." Rose was very still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He was a good surveyor. He was a better man." She picked up her pencil. "He taught me everything, including that being right is not the same as being safe, and that if you want justice, you have to be willing to do the tedious, unglamorous, extremely boring work of building an airtight case before you ever open your mouth in a room that matters." Charles looked at her. He said nothing. He was changed. The problem with what they were building was that Gerald Holt was not working alone, and the people he was working with had connections that made a straightforward legal case dangerous. The network Rose had been tracing, the same network Charles had been sent to investigate, had roots in the county sheriff's office, in the person of Deputy Sheriff Marcus Crane, who was Holt's primary instrument for intimidating landowners into signing documents they did not fully understand. It also had a connection, more distant but more alarming, to a land speculation company based in Galveston called the Southern Territories Investment Group, which was the closest thing to a headquarters the network had. Rose had known about Southern Territories for 4 months. Charles had known about them for 6. Neither of them had been able to make a direct legal connection between Southern Territories and the specific crimes in Hale County, because the connection was intentionally obscured through a chain of intermediaries, of which Gerald Holt was one link. The key was a man named Silas Pemberton. Pemberton was nominally a railroad agent who had been traveling through Hale County the previous summer, and Rose had found his name on 3 separate documents in the county records, not prominently, not in a way that was obviously significant, but in the margins of 2 surveying notes, and on the witness line of a document that he had no business witnessing, given that he was supposedly employed by the railroad and had no legal standing in land matters. Pemberton was the link between Holt and Southern Territories, and if she could find Pemberton and place him in Dust Creek on the dates when the fraudulent transfers were executed, and connect his presence to communications from the Galveston office, the case would be complete. She had been trying to find Silas Pemberton for 2 months before Charles arrived, and she had just located him when everything in Dust Creek began to accelerate. The night she found him, she came to the room above the hardware store that they had been using as a working space, and she spread a set of railroad employment records on the table and said, without sitting down, "Pemberton is in San Angelo. He left Hale County in October after the last transfer was completed. He is listed as a route surveyor for the Texas and Pacific Railway, but his employment file shows gaps of 6 to 8 weeks at a time that correspond exactly to the periods when the fraudulent transfers were being executed in Hale County and in 2 adjacent counties with similar patterns." Charles looked at the records. He looked at her. She was standing with her hands flat on the table and her weight forward and the lamp throwing gold light across the side of her face, and there was a quality to her focus in that moment that he could only describe as incandescent, not excited, not triumphant. Deeply, completely intent, the way a telescope lens is intent on a point of light. "If we can get his correspondence with Holt," Charles said. "There is a trunk," Rose said. "Holt keeps a locked trunk in the back office of his land agency. I have seen him open it twice through the window of the alley. Both times were after he received letters, and both times he put the letters inside it. The trunk is the archive. Getting into that trunk legally requires a warrant. Getting into that trunk at all requires that Holt not be in the building." She straightened. "He plays cards at the Silver Moon Saloon on Friday evenings from 8 until past midnight. The land agency is on the north side of Main Street. The lock on the back office window is not a proper mechanism. It is a bent nail that sits in a groove. I tested it from the outside 3 weeks ago with a thin piece of iron." Charles stared at her. "You tested it?" "I was planning ahead," she said, meeting his eyes. "I did not know at the time whether you were trustworthy. I was making contingency arrangements." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now, do you trust me now?" Rose looked at him for a long moment. There was something careful in her gaze, not cold but careful, the look of a person who has learned through considerable cost that trust is not a feeling but a conclusion, and that conclusions require evidence. "Yes," she said. "You have been consistent, you have shared information rather than hoarding it, and you have not once tried to take credit for findings that were mine. In my experience, that is uncommon enough to be meaningful." He almost smiled. "That is a very logical way to trust someone." "I find it is the most reliable way," she said. But there was a slight softening at the corner of her mouth that she did not seem to be aware of. He was aware of it. He was aware of it for a long time after. The Friday night operation went without incident, technically. Charles stood watch at the corner of the alley while Rose worked the bent nail with a length of thin iron she had been carrying for 3 weeks, opened the window, climbed into the back office of Gerald Holt's land agency, located the locked trunk, picked the trunk's padlock with a tool set that she produced from inside her coat with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had learned to be prepared for everything, and spent 45 minutes inside the darkened office, reading by the light of a small lantern, while Charles's heart did things in his chest that he refused to examine too closely. She emerged with notes, not the originals. She had copied them by hand, dates and names and key phrases, enough to demonstrate the content and trace the correspondence pattern. She had left everything exactly as she found it, relocked the trunk, replaced the tool in the groove, closed the window. Back in their working space, she spread the notes on the table and said, 11 letters from Pemberton to Holt over 18 months, all of them referencing transfer dates and payment schedules, and using a naming convention that ties to the Southern Territories accounts. The language is coded but not well coded. because they were arrogant enough to believe no one would ever read them. Pemberton's handwriting is distinctive, 2 letters to him that Holt drafted and kept copies of for his own protection, and 1 letter that names a partner in the Galveston office by initial and by street address. Charles looked at the notes. He looked at her. "You copied all of this in 45 minutes by lamplight." "My handwriting is small and my memory for relevant details is very good," she said. "I read the letters twice through before I began copying. The second read was for verification." He sat down at the table. He felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, something that he would have had trouble naming if pressed, which was the particular and uncommon sensation of being in the presence of someone who was fully and without performance themselves. Rose Bancroft was not trying to impress him. She had never tried to impress him. She simply did what she did, with the full weight of her intelligence and preparation and experience, and the impression was a byproduct he suspected she had never given much thought to. "Rose," he said. She looked up from the notes. Something in his voice had apparently registered as different, because she was watching him with a different quality of attention than she usually directed at work. "I have spent 3 years on this investigation," he said. "I have done it carefully and I am good at it. I want you to know that I am aware, very clearly, that you have been doing it for 10 years, and doing it while being dismissed and argued with and called reckless at every step. And I want to say that I think what you have built here is the most complete documentary case I have ever seen, and that you deserve to stand in a courtroom and present it, and that I will do everything in my capacity to make certain that happens." Rose was quiet. The lamplight moved. From somewhere down on Main Street came the sound of music from the Silver Moon, faint and cheerful and entirely removed from the world inside this room. "That is the first time," she said, and then stopped. She picked up her pencil, put it down. "That is the first time anyone in an official capacity has said that to me." "Then every official who spoke to you before was not paying attention," Charles said. The moment held. Then Rose picked up her pencil again and returned to the notes. But her jaw had changed. The slight hardness that lived there by default had relaxed into something quieter, and Charles turned back to the documents and did not say anything else, because he understood that she needed the work to be what it was, and that adding sentiment to it would change its nature in a way she did not want. And he was, above all things, a person who paid attention. What neither of them had accounted for was Deputy Sheriff Marcus Crane. Crane had been aware of Rose Bancroft for months, categorizing her as a nuisance rather than a genuine threat, which was a mistake common to men who confuse persistence with competence, and assumed that a woman working alone in a land records office was gathering gossip rather than evidence. When Charles Ashford arrived in Dusk Creek, Crane had noted his presence and had quietly made inquiries with the land office in Austin, which had confirmed, through a contact Crane had there, that Ashford was an investigator. Crane had not acted immediately because he needed direction from Holt, and Holt had been dismissive, telling him that a land office investigator without a warrant was just a man with a pencil. What changed was a small thing. A clerk in the county records office, a young man named Billy Frost, who was Crane's second cousin and who had been paid to note when Rose visited the records and what she looked at, had seen Rose and Charles reviewing documents together. He had told Crane. Crane had told Holt. Holt had stopped being dismissive. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks before the confrontation in the saloon. Charles came to their working space to find Rose already there, but differently positioned than usual. She was not at the table. She was standing at the window, looking down at the street, and there was a quality to her stillness that he had learned to read as different from her focused stillness. This was alert stillness, the stillness of something that has scented something dangerous. "Crane came to my boarding house last night," she said, without turning. "After 10 o'clock. He told my landlady that he had received a complaint about a female lodger conducting business activities from a private residence, which is not illegal, and he knows it. He wanted me to know he was watching." Charles set down the papers he was carrying. Did he say anything else? He said that Dust Creek was a quiet town and that people who stirred up trouble sometimes found the trail out of town smoother than the trail in. She turned from the window. He is not subtle, but he is dangerous because he has a badge and he has Holt behind him. And if they decide to move against us before we are ready to present the case, they can discredit what we have or worse. How much longer do you need? Charles said. 3 weeks. I need to receive confirmation from a contact in San Angelo that Pemberton is the man listed in the railroad records. I need a corroborating affidavit from one of the landowners who was pressured into signing, a man named Robert Callahan, who has agreed to speak but wants to wait until he has arranged to move his family out of the county first, which is a reasonable precaution. And I need the Galveston connection strengthened. The Galveston connection I can move on myself, Charles said. I can ride to Abilene and send a wire to my contact at the land office in Austin and have them initiate the Southern Territories inquiry formally. Once that inquiry is open, the case in Hale County becomes part of a larger federal matter, and Crane's ability to interfere locally becomes significantly more limited. Rose looked at him. That ride is a day and a half each way. I know. You would be gone for 3 days. I know. He met her eyes. Can you be careful for 3 days? Something moved across her face that was complicated and quiet. I have been careful for 10 years, she said. I think I can manage 3 days. He left the next morning. He rode north toward Abilene with the sensation, which he did not examine carefully, that he was leaving something important behind him. Not the documents. Not the case, something else. The 3 days without him were the longest Rose had experienced in Dust Creek, which was itself an unexpected piece of information about herself that she turned over cautiously and did not quite know what to do with. She worked. She met quietly with Robert Callahan, who was a weathered, careful man of 50 who had lost 80 acres of river land to a document he had been told was a routine easement agreement, and who had spent a year and a half being too frightened to speak about it. She walked him through the legal framework of what they were building, speaking slowly and clearly, and when she had finished he had sat for a long moment and then said, I always thought I was the foolish one for signing without reading it properly. You were deceived by professionals, Rose said. That is not foolishness, that is being targeted. He had looked at her the way several people in her life had looked at her when she said things that landed more truly than they expected. My wife said the same thing, he said. She said I should find you and talk to you. She said you were the sharp one. Rose had smiled at that, genuinely and without performance. Your wife sounds like a wise woman. She had walked home through the evening streets of Dust Creek feeling something that was adjacent to hope, which was a feeling she had trained herself to use carefully, the way a cook uses a very sharp knife, respecting its capacity for harm. Hope could be a trap. Hope could make you stop building the airtight case because you were already imagining the verdict. She had learned that from her father's death, which had happened in a world that should have been just and wasn't. And she had learned to keep her hope small and functional, and pointed at achievable specifics rather than at the larger idea that everything would eventually be all right. But walking home that evening in the golden failing light with Robert Callahan's quiet dignity in her mind, and the case nearly complete and 3 weeks of working alongside someone who met her without condescension, she found the hope was a little harder to keep small than usual. She was at her boarding house when the front door opened, and Marcus Crane walked in without knocking. He was alone, which surprised her, because men like Crane typically moved in pairs when they intended to frighten someone. He was tall and going to fat in the middle, with a mustache that was too large for his face and pale eyes that were not stupid, which was the most dangerous thing about him. He was not stupid. He was corrupt, and vicious and stupid would have been safer. Miss Bancroft, he said, with the particular pleasantry that men like him used to remind women that pleasantry could become its opposite in an instant. I hear your associate has left town. He is returning in 2 days, Rose said. She was sitting at the small table in the parlor which she was paying extra for the use of. Her notebooks were there. She did not reach for them or cover them. She simply looked at him. I wonder if you'd care to have a conversation about what you've been doing with your time here in Dust Creek, Crane said. As a courtesy, before things become official. I would be happy to have any conversation you'd like to have, Rose said, in the presence of the circuit court clerk as a witness, a small hardening around his eyes. That's not necessary. I find it is the most reliable way, Rose said, and the phrase settled in her mind with a particular resonance that surprised her, because she had only said it once before and to someone else entirely. If there are official questions about my activities, an official setting would be most appropriate. I am happy to speak to Sheriff Giddings directly at the courthouse at any hour he names. Crane looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating. She could see it happening, the slow arithmetic of intimidation, which works by making its target feel isolated and outmatched and slightly unreal. It required a certain kind of response to work, a shrinking response, a response that acknowledged the power differential. Rose gave him none of that. She sat and looked at him with the same quality of calm attention she brought to difficult survey problems, and after a long moment he said, "You are making things harder for yourself than they need to be." "I have been hearing that for a long time," Rose said. "It has not yet proven to be true." He left without saying anything else. Rose sat for a moment after the door closed, breathing carefully, and then she picked up her pencil and wrote the date and time and Crane's exact words in her fax notebook, because everything was evidence, and you never knew when you would need it. Charles came back on a Friday afternoon, 2 days earlier than expected, and he came back with a wire from Austin that made the Galveston inquiry official and a written instruction from the head of the General Land Office authorizing him to request the cooperation of the Hale County Sheriff in the investigation, which meant that if Sheriff Giddings was not himself compromised, which Charles had reason to believe was the case, the legal framework had shifted significantly. He found Rose in their working space and she told him about Crane's visit, and he listened with his whole attention and then was quiet for a moment and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because he was looking at her with a quality of concern that was not patronizing but was genuine and specific, she added, "It was not pleasant, but I have had worse." "I know," he said quietly. "I know you have." Something about the simplicity of that moved something in her. She looked at the table. She looked at the documents that represented 10 years of her life and her father's name, and 100 acres of stolen land, and the quiet dignity of Robert Callahan, and the shape of a network of corruption that ran from small county courthouses all the way to a speculation company in Galveston. She looked at the fax notebook and the inference notebook and the careful separate categories she had built to be unimpeachable. She looked at Charles Ashford, who had watched her work for 3 weeks without once trying to direct her or improve her or explain to her what she already knew, who had said she deserved to stand in a courtroom, who had come back 2 days early because Crane had visited her. "Why did you come back early?" she said. He met her eyes. He did not look away. "Because I was worried about you," he said, plainly, without decoration. Rose was very still for a moment. "That was not operationally necessary," she said. "No," he agreed. "It was not." The moment was very quiet. Then Rose said carefully, "I do not have much practice with people who worry about me." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you work for 3 weeks, and you are the most self-sufficient person I have ever met, and I suspect that is partly because you have had to be, and partly because you are genuinely built that way, and partly because no one has made it safe to be anything else." He paused. "I did not come back early to interfere. I came back early because I would rather be here." The sentence landed the way important sentences do, not with drama but with weight. Rose was quiet for a long moment. The lamplight was steady. The town outside made its ordinary sounds. She said very quietly, "I am glad you came back early." Charles said nothing, but something in his expression moved toward warmth in a way that she found, unexpectedly, that she did not want to look away from. They did not speak of it again that night. They worked until past midnight. organizing the case files into the formal structure that the land office investigation required. And the work was what it was, precise and focused and shared between two people who understood each other's methods well enough by now to move around each other in the working space without collision, handing documents back and forth with an efficiency that came from paying close attention rather than from familiarity, though familiarity was there too now, settled in like weather. The confrontation with Gerald Holt was not planned. Rose had been planning to wait for the formal presentation of the case to the circuit court, which was scheduled for 10 days hence, and which the land office wire had made possible by establishing federal jurisdiction. But on the Tuesday of the following week, something happened that changed the timeline in a way that neither she nor Charles had anticipated. Robert Callahan was beaten. He was not killed, but he was beaten badly enough that his wife sent a neighbor's boy to find Rose at the crack of dawn on Tuesday morning. And Rose had arrived at the Callahan property on the edge of town to find Robert in his wife's care with a broken rib and a bruised face. And the neighbor had said that two men had come to the house the previous night, and the men had not introduced themselves, but one of them had ridden a distinctive gray horse with a white blaze that Robert's wife had seen clearly in the moonlight. And the gray horse with the white blaze was tied outside the Silver Moon Saloon on Friday nights beside a saddle with an engraved silver horn, and the saddle belonged to Marcus Crane. Rose had been very still in the Callahan kitchen, looking at the floor, while Mrs. Callahan made tea that no one was going to drink. She was thinking in the way she thought when something important had changed, and she needed to recalibrate. She was thinking that Robert Callahan could not wait 3 more weeks to move his family. She was thinking that if Crane knew about Robert, Crane knew about the case, or suspected enough to act on suspicion. She was thinking that the timeline had been taken from her. She went back to Main Street. She went to the land agency. She walked in through the front door, which was open for business, at 8:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, and Gerald Holt was behind his desk with a coffee cup and a newspaper. And when he looked up at her, his expression changed in the way expressions change when a person realizes that the threat they have been managing quietly has unexpectedly walked into the room. She did not have a plan precisely. She had a body of knowledge and a set of facts and a clear understanding of where the pressure points were in Holt's position. And she had a gun that had belonged to her father and that she carried because it was the Wild West in 1882, and a woman alone had every rational reason to be armed. She did not plan to shoot him. She was not reckless. She pressed the gun against her thigh with the barrel pointed at the floor, and she stood in the middle of his office and she said, "Robert Callahan will be presenting an affidavit to the circuit court in 9 days. Whatever you were hoping to prevent by sending Crane to his home last night, you have failed to prevent it. I want you to know that." Holt had stared at her. "You are making a very dangerous mistake," he said. "You've been telling me that since January," Rose said, "and yet here we are." That was when Charles Ashford walked through the saloon door, except it was not the saloon. It was the land agency. The story had begun in the land agency, and Charles came through the door not because he had followed her, though he had, and not because he had predicted what she would do, though he had, but because he had woken that morning to find her gone from their working space where she had often been the first one there, and had been told by her landlady that she had gone to the Callahan property, and had gone to find out why, and had heard at the Callahan house what had happened to Robert, and had tracked her path back to Main Street and through the door of Gerald Holt's land agency, with a very controlled expression that told no one who did not know him well what he was feeling. And Rose Bancroft knew him well enough by now to read it clearly. She glanced at him. He glanced at her. The glance was brief and comprehensive and said several things at once, including, "Are you all right? And yes, I know you had a plan, and also I am here now," and the last thing was not said as control or interference but as fact, in the same way that the mountains were fact and the sky was fact. Holt looked between them. He was calculating again. Calculating alone versus together. calculating what they knew and what they could prove, calculating whether the network that had always protected him was still intact enough to hold. It was not, and some part of him knew it, and his calculation was showing it in the set of his jaw. "You have no evidence that I have done anything illegal," he said. "I have 11 letters," Rose said. "I have copies of their content. I have the dates and the payment schedules and the naming conventions. I have the correspondence pattern that connects you to Silas Pemberton and through Pemberton to the Southern Territories Investment Group in Galveston. I have Robert Callahan's affidavit. I have the original 1876 survey plat for the Callahan property showing that the boundary stakes were moved. I have a land office investigation with federal jurisdiction." She paused. "I have also recorded in my notebook, dated and timed and witnessed this morning by Mrs. Callahan and her neighbor, the description of the gray horse with the white blaze that was tied at the Callahan property last night. I have enough." Holt's face had gone the color of uncooked dough. He looked at Charles. She is correct," Charles said in the tone he used for statements of fact. "On all counts." There was a long silence. Outside, Main Street went about its business. A dog barked. A cart horse clipped by on the packed dirt. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in Dust Creek, Texas, in the late spring of 1882. Holt reached into his desk drawer. Rose raised the gun from her thigh, not aiming it, just raising it, the gesture clear as language. Charles's hand moved to his jacket. Holt brought out a sheaf of papers and set them on the desk. "Those are originals," he said. His voice had changed. "Smaller. From the trunk. The ones that Pemberton sent. I kept them as protection." He laughed briefly and without humor. "I always thought I would use them if Southern Territories ever decided I was inconvenient. I did not expect a woman surveyor from Missouri to make the point moot." Rose looked at the papers on the desk. She looked at Charles. Charles looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of a person watching something long and painful and deserved arrive for someone they had come to care about very much. "Pick them up," she said quietly to him. "They're yours to take into official custody. Your investigation, your jurisdiction, your chain of evidence." He shook his head slightly. "They're yours, Rose. You brought us here." "And you have the federal authority to secure them," she said. "I am a private citizen. You are the land office. Take them and do this correctly." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped forward and secured the papers. He also, she noticed, made very certain to note in his official log that the documents had been volunteered by Gerald Holt in the presence of Rose Bancroft, whose investigation had brought the matter to resolution. He was careful that way. He had always been careful that way. Gerald Holt was taken into custody by Sheriff Giddings that afternoon. Marcus Crane attempted to leave Dust Creek before dawn the following morning and was intercepted at the Northern Road by a pair of federal marshals who had arrived from Abilene on the morning train, alerted by the wire Charles had sent from Austin. Silas Pemberton was apprehended in San Angelo 2 weeks later. The Southern Territories Investment Group in Galveston was indicted by a federal grand jury in July of 1882, and the case that brought the indictment was built almost entirely from the documents that Rose Bancroft had been assembling for the better part of a decade, supplemented by the official investigation records of the Texas General Land Office. She stood in the circuit court at Lubbock in September of 1882 and presented testimony for 4 hours before the circuit judge, a man named Hartwell who had white eyebrows and the expression of a person who had heard a great deal over a long career and was rarely surprised. She was precise, organized, and clear. She spoke from her facts notebook. She referred to her inference records and walked the court through every step from inference to corroborated fact. She was not interrupted. She was not condescended to. Judge Hartwell asked 3 questions, all of them substantive and specific, and she answered each one without hesitation. Charles sat in the gallery for the full 4 hours. He did not fidget. He did not look around. He watched her work. Robert Callahan was in the gallery too, with a healed rib and his wife beside him, and a look on his face that had moved some distance from the frightened silence of his kitchen towards something that was not quite peace, but was its cousin. Two other families whose land had been taken were also present. They had heard about the case from Robert. They were cautious about hope in the specific way that people who have been systematically deceived become cautious about hope, but they were there. The verdict on Holt's case came 3 days later, guilty on 7 counts of fraudulent land transfer, conspiracy, and coercion. Marcus Crane was convicted in a separate proceeding in November. The Southern Territories case moved through the federal system and produced convictions the following spring. Robert Callahan's land was ordered restored. The other families received judgments. It was not complete. Not everything was recovered. The law was imperfect, and so was its implementation, and there were losses that could not be legally compensated because they were the kind of losses that live in a person's body rather than on a deed. But the network was broken. The pattern was documented. The shape of the thing, which Rose had been tracing since she was a grieving 17-year-old girl in Missouri who knew the truth and had no one to tell, was now in the official record where it would remain. She walked out of the Lubbock courthouse on the afternoon of the verdict into September sunlight that was still warm and full of dust and smelled of horses and dry grass and the specific weather of the Texas plains, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed. Charles came out behind her. He stood beside her, not touching, looking out at the street. After a moment he said, "How does it feel?" Rose thought about it, because she took questions seriously, and this one deserved a serious answer. "Like putting something down that I have been carrying for a very long time," she said. "Like the moment after you finish a very difficult calculation and you check it 3 times and it is correct. Like relief, except quieter than I expected relief to feel." "That is the accurate description of relief," Charles said. "The dramatic version is a story people tell. The real version is very quiet." She looked at him sideways. "Is that from experience?" "Some years ago I resolved a case that had taken 4 years and involved a series of fraudulent mining claims in 3 separate counties. I expected to feel triumphant. I felt tired and quiet, and after a few days, grateful. The gratitude was the most genuine part." "What were you grateful for?" He was quiet for a moment. "A horse cart went past. The sunlight moved. For being the kind of person who was built to do the work," he said. "For having found work that was worth doing. For having, eventually, found the right people to do it with." He did not look at her when he said the last part. But the last part was clearly different from the first 2. Rose looked at the street. She felt the warmth of the September sun on her face. She thought about 10 years of being called reckless by people who had not watched her think. She thought about her father's small handwriting in the margins of survey maps. She thought about 3 weeks in a working space in Dust Creek with lamplight and carefully separated notebooks, and a man who had watched her find a contradiction and gone very still and said nothing. "I have been thinking about what comes next," she said. Charles turned toward her slightly. "And the pattern I have been tracing does not only apply to Hale County. The land office file you read in Austin, the 15-year record that has my father's name in it, it covers 8 states and territories. There are more cases, more networks, more Robert Callahans in other counties who have signed documents they did not understand." She paused. "I would like to keep working on the broader investigation," Charles said, "if the land office would sanction it. I believe," he said carefully, "that the land office would be very interested in hiring a consultant with your specific expertise in land fraud documentation and survey record analysis, particularly given the case record you have just built." He paused. "I may have mentioned that possibility in my report to Austin 3 weeks ago." Rose looked at him. "You did what?" "I noted that the most valuable investigative contribution to the Hale County case had come from a private citizen with extensive expertise and 10 years of relevant experience, and I suggested that formalizing a consulting arrangement would be in the land office's interest." He met her eyes. "I should have told you I was going to do that. I apologize for not asking first." "You recommended me," Rose said. I recommended the best investigator I have ever worked with, he said simply. The fact that it was you was the relevant fact. Something happened in her chest that was not the small and functional hope she had trained herself to use carefully. It was something larger and less manageable, and it surprised her with its size. "Charles," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. September in Lubbock, Texas, on the courthouse steps, with the heat and the dust and the horses and the sound of the town around them, and two people who had been paying close attention to each other for 5 months, and something that had been building with the slow inevitability of weather. "I am not very experienced at this," she said. "The other part. The part that is not work." "Neither am I," he said. "Historically, I have found the work easier to be good at." "But you came back 2 days early," she said, "from Abilene." "Yes." "That was not because of the work." "No," he said. "It was not." Rose was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I find that I have been thinking about you in the space that is not occupied by the case for approximately 3 weeks, and that the thinking is not analytical, and that I am not entirely certain what to do with that, but I believe ignoring it would be a failure of intellectual honesty." Charles looked at her for a moment with an expression that was warm and specific, and had more than a little laughter in it. The laughter of someone who found the thing they were experiencing genuinely delightful rather than merely pleasant. "I have been thinking about you in the space that is not occupied by the case for considerably longer than 3 weeks, he said, "and I am also not certain what to do with it, though I believe the first step might be dinner." Rose felt something ease in her that had been tight for a very long time, not all at once, carefully, like a door opening onto a room that turned out to be better than expected. "That seems like a reasonable first step," she said. They had dinner that evening at the best restaurant in Lubbock, which was not very grand but was clean and had good beef, and a proprietress who brought bread that was warm from the oven, and they talked for 3 hours about things that were not the case. Rose told him about her father, about Missouri and the river bottomland, and the way Thomas Bancroft had explained the philosophy of surveying to her, which was that every boundary was a human agreement, and the work of a surveyor was to serve the agreement rather than any one party to it, and that when surveyors lied they did not merely falsify numbers, they broke the social contract at its foundation. Charles told her about growing up in Virginia, where his father had been a county attorney and had taken him to court from a young age, and explained the law the way Thomas Bancroft had explained surveying, as a structure for human beings to live together without destroying each other, imperfect and requiring constant maintenance and worth defending anyway. They shared, Rose discovered, a quality of fundamental seriousness about the work they did that was not grimness but was rootedness, a knowledge of what the work was for, and why it mattered that went deeper than career or even vocation, that was in both of them woven into the way they understood the world. She had never talked about this with anyone who simply knew it already without needing it explained. She had never had to explain it to Charles. He had known it from the first hour. She thought about that walking back to the hotel in the warm September dark. She thought about how lonely she had been for a very long time in a way that had been invisible to her until it began to lift. Charles walked beside her, and they did not fill the silence with noise, because they were both people who understood the value of silence that had something in it, and this silence had everything in it. At the door of the hotel he said, "I should like to see you tomorrow." "I will be here," she said. "And the day after?" "Good," he said. He looked at her in the dark. He said, "Rose, I want to say something that is not in the category of work." "All right," she said. "I think you are extraordinary," he said. "Not in the way people mean when they say it to perform a compliment. I mean it in the strict sense. I have encountered, in my professional life, a great many intelligent people, and I have not encountered anyone who thinks the way you do, with that particular combination of rigor and patience, and the capacity to hold a long chain of reasoning together over years without losing the thread. I think that the world has done you a sustained injustice by failing to recognize that." I think that the people who called you reckless were people who had never watched you think, and I have watched you think, and I want you to know that it changed something in me that I did not expect to be changed." The night was quiet around them. Rose stood on the hotel step and looked at this man who had ridden back from Abilene 2 days early and had given her credit in an official report, and had watched her for 4 hours in a courtroom with his complete attention. And she thought about what her father had told her once when she was 14, and asking him why he did the work so carefully when no one seemed to care. He had said, "Because the work knows." Because the truth of a boundary does not change whether anyone acknowledges it. The land is what it is regardless of what the deed says, and if you do the work right, you are in agreement with reality, and that is its own reward. She had understood it then as a child understands something, partially. She understood it now fully, and she understood that she had been in agreement with reality for 10 years and it had been a sustaining thing, the most sustaining thing she had, and that the possibility of being in agreement with reality alongside someone who comprehended it the same way was something she had not known she was looking for. "Thank you," she said. "For watching." She paused. "For being changed," he smiled. It was a real smile, unguarded, and she stored the sight of it carefully. "Good night, Rose," he said. "Good night, Charles," she said. She went inside. She stood in the small hotel room with the window open to the warm Texas night and the sound of crickets coming in and something enormous and quiet and hopeful moving through her, and she let herself feel it for a moment without making it smaller or more functional or more careful. Then she took out her fax notebook. And in the margins, very small, she wrote his name. The autumn that followed was the kind of autumn that people who live well-chosen lives remember for the rest of those lives. Rose and Charles both returned to Dust Creek briefly to close out the final details of the Hale County case, to hand records to the circuit court clerk, to say goodbye to Robert Callahan and his wife, who had begun the work of reclaiming their land and who had named their new dog Rose. A fact that Charles found quietly wonderful, and which he mentioned to her with a warmth in his voice that made her laugh for the first time in front of him, in a way that was genuine and unguarded, and that he held as carefully as she had held the sight of his smile. They were both in Dust Creek for only 3 weeks before the next step became clear. The land office had responded to Charles's report with a formal offer to Rose of a consulting arrangement, paying a monthly retainer in exchange for her expertise on land fraud methodology. And the offer had come with a request that she and Charles work together on the next case in the investigation, which was in New Mexico territory and involved a similar pattern of fraudulent transfers targeting Hispanic landowners whose title claims predated the American acquisition and were being systematically challenged through falsified surveys. Rose had read the offer and the request twice, and then looked at Charles across the table in their old working space, where the lamp was burning and the notebooks were open, and the autumn wind was making the window rattle in its frame, and she said, "New Mexico territory." "Yes," he said. "The pattern in New Mexico is older and more deeply entrenched than Hale County," she said. "The Hispanic land grant system has its own legal framework under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which means the law is more complex and the fraud is correspondingly more sophisticated." "Yes," he said, "it will take longer, possibly years. Almost certainly years." "I would need to learn the land grant legal structure properly," she said, "which I can do. I have some foundational knowledge, but I would need to build on it significantly." "I know you can," he said. She looked at him. "Are you asking me to go to New Mexico with you?" "The land office is asking you," he said carefully, "and I am asking separately and with different intent." "Different intent," she repeated. "I am asking," he said, with the particular direct quality that she had come to understand was how he said the most important things, without decoration or misdirection, "because I do not want to do the next case without you. And not only because you are the best investigator I have ever worked with." The lamplight held steady. The window rattled. Rose looked at the man across the table from her, who was 31 years old and had dark hair going silver at the temples, and who had watched her work without ever needing to change what he saw, who had ridden back 2 days early from Abilene because he was worried, who had noted in an official government report that she deserved the credit, who had said on courthouse steps in September that watching her think had changed something in him that he had not expected to be changed. "I am not good at being anything other than what I am," she said. "I am aware that this has been inconvenient for most people who have attempted to know me." "I do not find it inconvenient," he said. "I find it one of the most important things about you." She was quiet for a moment. "I have never," she said carefully, "allowed the possibility of something like this to interfere with the work." "Nor have I," he said. "I also do not believe it has to interfere. I believe two people who both understand what the work is for are more likely to support each other in it than to interfere with it." "That is a reasonable hypothesis," Rose said. "I think it is a sound one," he said. "But I am aware it requires testing." She held his eyes across the table. Then she said, "Ask me properly." Charles was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Rose Bancroft, I have been watching you work for 5 months, and I have been changed by it in every way that matters. I believe you are the most honest and most capable person I have ever met, and I believe that the 10 years you spent being called reckless by people who did not pay attention were a sustained and specific injustice. I want to spend the rest of my life paying attention, if you will allow it." Rose felt the enormous, quiet, hopeful thing move through her again, larger and less careful than before, and she did not try to make it smaller. She said, "Yes." It was not a dramatic yes. It was the same tone in which she confirmed a fact in her facts notebook. But Charles heard all of it, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on it before, something very open and warm and unguarded, and she thought, with a sudden clarity that surprised her, that she loved his face. They were married in February of 1883 in Lubbock, Texas, at the courthouse where she had testified the previous September. Judge Hartwell presided, because he had heard the case and had the white eyebrows and had asked 3 substantive questions, and they liked him. Robert Callahan and his wife attended. Marcus Webb, Rose's old mentor, who was 70 now and had come from New Mexico when he heard, attended, and when he met Charles he shook his hand for a long time and said, "She is the best I ever trained," and Charles said, "I know," and Marcus had looked at him and said, "Good." There were wildflowers on the courthouse table, the ones that grew in February in West Texas, which were not many but were there. Rose wore a dress she had bought in Lubbock, a blue wool dress that was not elaborate but was good quality, and she wore her hair differently than she usually wore it, down over one shoulder in a way that made Charles go very still when he saw her in the courthouse doorway, and she noticed him going still and filed it in the place where she kept the sight of his smile. They left for New Mexico territory in March, traveling by rail to El Paso and then by wagon and horse into the territory. The work was harder and more complex than Hale County, as Rose had predicted. The land grant system under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a tangle of Spanish colonial law and American property law and political expediency, and the fraud being committed against Hispanic landowning families had been ongoing for decades and had powerful advocates in the territorial government. Rose spent 4 months learning the legal framework and another 3 months building contacts in the communities whose land was being stolen, learning enough Spanish to conduct preliminary interviews, which Charles observed with a mixture of admiration and affection that he no longer attempted to keep to himself. He had discovered that being no longer alone with his feelings changed the texture of daily life in ways that were small and constant and consistently better than the alternative. He told her what he was thinking. He asked her what she was thinking. They argued sometimes, productively, about methodological questions and strategic choices, and the arguments were brisk and honest and left both of them in better positions than they had started in. They were quiet together in the evenings, in a way that was full rather than empty. He learned that she woke before him and that she liked to read in the early morning, and that she made a particular expression when something she was reading surprised her that was different from all her other expressions. She learned that he could not sleep if a problem was unresolved, and that the resolution he needed was sometimes just to talk it through out loud, and that after she talked it through with him he slept, and that the gift of that was not small. They lived in a rented house in a small town called Las Cruces for 14 months, while the New Mexico investigation built toward completeness. It was a house with whitewashed walls and a courtyard, and an acequia running nearby that she could hear at night through the window. She planted herbs in the courtyard because she had a practical interest in useful plants, and because it gave her something to do with her hands in the evenings when she had been reading documents all day and needed to think in a different mode. He built a bookshelf for the second bedroom, which they called the working room, and the bookshelf was slightly crooked at one end, which she pointed out, and he said he was aware, and she said it did not matter, and he said he would fix it, and she said she found it endearing, and he looked at her with such warmth that she felt it in her chest. She was 29 years old and living in New Mexico territory with a man who thought her mind was one of the most interesting things he had ever encountered, doing work that mattered for reasons that went all the way down to the deepest roots of what she understood the world to require, and she was profoundly and persistently happy in a way that was not loud or demonstrative but was constant, like water running underground, reliable and clean. In the autumn of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Charles on an evening in October when the courtyard was gold with dying light, and the herbs were still alive, and the work had just reached a critical juncture. She told him the way she told him most things that were important, directly and without preamble, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he came to where she was standing and put both arms around her and said nothing, just held her. And she stood in the circle of that and felt, with great clarity, that the world contained more than she had thought. Their son was born in May of 1885 in Las Cruces. They named him Thomas for her father. He was small and emphatic and not interested in sleeping, which Charles bore with more patience than Rose had expected, sitting up with the baby in the rocking chair he had bought for the purpose, working through documents by lamplight with Thomas against his shoulder. She watched this from the doorway on several nights and felt something that required no categorization, that simply was. The New Mexico case reached the territorial court in the summer of 1885. It was larger and more complex than the Hale County case, involving 41 fraudulent land transfers affecting 19 families over 15 years, and it named 11 defendants including 3 members of the territorial legislature. Rose's testimony took 2 days. It was, the court recorder noted in his official summary, the most comprehensive documentation of land fraud in the history of the territory, and it had been built almost entirely by a woman who had been dismissed, condescended to, and threatened at every step of the process and had simply continued working. The verdicts came in the fall, not all guilty on all counts. The law was still imperfect. But 9 of the 11 defendants were convicted, and 14 of the 19 families received legal judgments restoring or compensating their land, and the pattern was documented in the official record in a way that would make the same fraud harder to execute in the future. Charles came to find Rose after the verdicts were read. She was standing outside the court in the October afternoon light, and she had the particular expression she had when something long and weighted had been set down. He stood beside her and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Your father would have been proud." She was very still. Then she said quietly, "I know, I have been thinking that." She looked up at the sky. "I have been thinking that for 2 days, actually, since we finished the testimony. I kept wanting to write him a letter." She paused. "I wrote one actually last night. I wrote him a letter about the case and about Thomas and about you. I know it is not." She stopped. "What did you say?" Charles asked. She looked at him. "I said that I had found exactly what he taught me to look for, work worth doing and the right people to do it with." She paused. "I said his name is in the official record now. The Bancroft survey complaint of 1872, It is part of the documented history of the pattern that led to all of this. He is part of the record. Charles took her hand. She held it, which she had become very good at, the holding of his hand, the particular warmth and weight of it. He is part of the record, Charles agreed. And so are you. Rose Bancroft of Dusk Creek, Texas, and Lubbock and Las Cruces, the most precise surveyor of human dishonesty that the American West has ever produced. She laughed, genuine and unguarded. The October light moved over both of them. They returned to Texas at the beginning of 1886 because the land office had need of them in Austin, and because Charles had been offered a position as chief investigator for the new division of land fraud, which was a division created partly as a direct result of the cases they had built together. He was offered the title. He asked whether Rose could be formally appointed as deputy investigator rather than consultant, with the same legal standing and commensurate compensation, and he was told this was unusual, and he said he was aware, and he said that the work of the last 3 years had demonstrated that it was also correct, and after consideration they agreed. Rose Bancroft Ashford, Deputy Investigator, Texas General Land Office, 1886. She had a nameplate made. They bought a house in Austin on a quiet street near the land office. It had a garden that Charles tried to help with and was not good at, which she found endearing, and a study large enough for both of their desks, which was the first thing they set up. The bookshelf from Las Cruces came with them, still slightly crooked at one end. Thomas learned to walk in the Austin garden in the summer of 1886, in the particular experimental way that first steps happen, falling and getting up and falling again with absolute determination. Rose sat on the step watching him and felt the gratitude that Charles had described on courthouse steps in Lubbock, the real version, quiet and honest. Charles sat beside her and they watched their son move through the world for the first time on his own 2 feet. He has your stubbornness, Charles said. He falls down and gets up, Rose said. That is not stubbornness. That is simply how walking works. In your case, I have never been entirely certain there was a difference. She looked at him with the side of her mouth curving. That is possibly true. He took her hand. Thomas fell down and got up. The garden was warm and full of summer, the good ordinary summer of a life being lived well. The work continued. It would always continue, because the patterns of human dishonesty were persistent and required persistent response, and Rose had understood this from the time she was 17 and had built herself into the most effective possible response. She trained younger investigators in the land office, women and men both, teaching the methodology she had developed, the 2 notebooks, the rigorous separation of fact and inference, the patient long-game thinking that made recklessness look different once you understood it. She taught them that recklessness as a label was often applied by people who were watching the surface and not the depth, and that the depth was where the work was, and that you had to be willing to be misread in order to do the work correctly. Charles ran the division with the same quality of quiet competence he had brought to everything, supporting the work, removing obstacles, making certain that the people doing the most important and most dangerous investigations had what they needed to do them safely. He was better at this than he had expected to be, and he suspected it was partly because he had spent 4 years watching someone do very difficult work in very difficult conditions, and had internalized a specific and useful understanding of what support actually looked like as opposed to what it performed to look like. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1887. They named her Clara, for Rose's mother. She was dark-haired like Charles and precise like Rose, and from a very early age had the quality of watching things with great attention before acting on them, which both of her parents recognized, and neither of them commented on for the first 2 years, until the day Rose watched Clara sit in the garden and observe a bird for 20 unmoving minutes before reaching out a hand toward it with infinite patience, and then said quietly to Charles, "She is going to be better than both of us." Charles was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Probably." "Good," Rose said. "They had their disagreements. They had their hard seasons. The times when the work was dangerous and the cases felt hopeless, and the pattern of human dishonesty seemed inexhaustible. In 1889, there was a case in West Texas that turned violent in a way that neither of them had anticipated, and that came closer to serious harm than anything since Marcus Crane. And there were 2 weeks afterward when Rose was quieter than usual, and Charles was watchful in a way that was tender rather than anxious. And one evening she said, "I am all right," and he said, "I know," and she said, "I am just remembering how alone I used to feel when things were hard," and he said, "You are not alone," and she said, "I know," and the two I knows held each other like two hands. Austin in the early 1890s was growing, changing, becoming something different from the rough frontier town it had been, and the land office work evolved with it, becoming more legal and procedural, and less dangerous in the physical sense, though no less important. Rose found herself doing more work that was consultative and educational, advising on cases rather than building them from the ground up, writing methodological guides for the land office that became standard training materials. She was 37 years old in 1892, and she had been doing this work for 20 years, and she was better at it than she had ever been. And the labor of it was different now, more considered, more connected to the long view. Thomas was 7 and Clara was 5, and they had a life in Austin that was the life Rose had not known she was building toward when she was a 17-year-old girl in Missouri who knew the truth and had no one to tell. There were evenings in the study with 2 desks lit by lamps and the children asleep, and the city quiet and the work still ongoing, still necessary, still real, and the man across the room who had watched her think and said nothing and been changed. There were mornings when Thomas asked her questions about surveying, and she answered them the way her father had answered hers, all the way down, not simplified, trusting the child with the real shape of the thing. There were afternoons when Clara sat in the garden and watched things with great attention, and Rose thought, "She will be better than both of us," and felt something that was not envy but was exactly like pride. There was a day in the summer of 1893 when Rose was going through the old files from the Hale County case, which she did occasionally when a current case required reference to the earlier methods, and she found in the back of her inference notebook, in the margins in very small writing, his name. She sat for a moment looking at it. Then she carried the notebook to his desk and set it in front of him, open to the page, and pointed to it without saying anything. Charles looked at the page. He looked at the date beside the name. He looked at her. "September of 1882, he said, "on the courthouse steps. The night you told me you came back early because you would rather be here," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now," she looked at him. The question had a simple answer and also a vast one, and she gave him both. "Now," she said, "you are always here." He reached across the desk and took her hand. She held it. The study was warm and the lamps were burning, and outside the Austin evening was doing what it always did, going gold and then dark and then full of stars. And the work was ongoing, and the children were asleep, and the slightly crooked bookshelf from Las Cruces was still there against the wall with its crooked end that she had found endearing and never let him fix. Rose Bancroft had been called reckless by everyone who had never watched her think. Charles Ashford had watched her think on a Thursday afternoon in the doorway of a county clerk's office in Dust Creek, Texas, in March of 1882, and he had said nothing and had been changed. He had spent the rest of his life paying attention, and she had spent the rest of her life being known, fully and precisely, by the one person who had understood from the first that there was nothing reckless in her at all, only a long and patient and absolutely certain pursuit of what was true. Their third child, a boy they named James, was born in the spring of 1894. He was loud and cheerful and very little like either of them, which they both found delightful. Thomas, at 9, appointed himself the authority on everything James related and took this responsibility more seriously than anyone had asked him to. Clara, at 7, observed James with the same 20-minute bird-watching attention, and then announced that he was interesting and would require significant supervision, which proved to be entirely correct. Charles had gray at his temples and Rose had lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting at maps in the Texas sun, and they sat on the porch of the Austin house in the evening sometimes, not always talking, sometimes just being in the same space in the companionable way of people who have learned that the company of someone who truly knows you is the most valuable thing the world offers, more valuable than triumph or recognition, more sustaining than justice even. Because justice was external and required constant maintenance and could always be undone. But this, the particular fact of being known and staying known by someone who chose to keep looking, was not external and did not require maintenance and could not be undone. The record existed. Thomas Bancroft's name was in it. Rose Bancroft's name was in it. The land was what it was, and they had done the work right, and they were in agreement with reality. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole world.